won't prioritize because each of the goals has its constituents, and if you prioritize, then you irritate the constituents, but if you don't prioritize, then you can't implement the plan. So what Lomborg did was gather a teams of economists, multiple teams, some of whom were Nobel Prize-winning economists. He had them assemble teams. He had them rank order development goals in terms of their return on investment, all of the teams. Then he averaged across the teams and came up with a final list, and addressing global warming wasn't even on the list. The most fundamental, he wrote a book called How to Spend $75 Billion to Make the World a Better Place, and that's not very much money on a global scale. Almost everything that he recommended had to do with increased child nutrition in developing countries.
So a very interesting thing he mentions, and I'm going to go back to the title of that book just for 1 second here, How to Spend $75 Billion in Making the World a Better Place. And we've long said and we've long talked about this and how ultimately humanity exists in this point, in this state of being right now, where we are always looking to our politicians to solve something, and our politicians have this little thing in their ear called the deep state. And the deep state is mechanically, manipulatively, and from a very controlling perspective, projecting what the future will look like for humanity. Here's what we need to do. Here's how things need to happen. And you notice that the grip on people gets tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter as things go on. What does this tell us? That ultimately there is no shortage, and we've said this for so many years, there is no shortage of solutions to solve the problems that we have as humanity. Absolutely none. Zero shortage. This thing we call money is completely made up. It's an idea that we designed, that we made up, that we now think controls every single aspect of our entire lives. When we buy into these systems that were put there by people that were hoping to maintain complete and utter control over the population of the entire earth, you start to realize, well, hold on a second, their agendas are the only thing that's really holding back humanity from making changes. This book and what's outlined in it when you're talking about how to spend $75 billion to make the world a better place is the exact same types of observations and commonsensical solutions that people come up with that say, hold on, wait a minute, we can solve all these issues that we pretend that we have that we can't solve. They're so easy to solve, but why are they not going to happen? Well, they're not going to happen because the political spectrum, the way things function from a top-down level within society are not designed to solve the problems. We don't need a ton of money to even solve the problems that we have in a lot of cases. It's just the way that it's designed right now. And when we keep putting all of our attention and all of our energy and all of our focus, as we have for decades and decades and decades, into thinking that a new government, a new system will solve what's going on, we continually see over and over again, hey, that didn't solve it this time. In fact, now things are a little bit worse in some cases and better in other cases. I mean, it's like, hey, that didn't solve it again, and things are again a little bit worse in some cases and a little bit better in other cases. Oh, hey, it didn't solve it again. We keep going through this cycle over and over and over again. Why? And it gets to a point that I'm going to make in just a second that discusses a time humanity is experiencing right now that is radically different than any other time that we've been in prior to now.
It's like these things are complicated, man. These are complicated. It's like, well, let's fix global warming. It's like, okay, well, good luck with that. First of all, how are you going to do that? And to think that will unite us, well, certainly not uniting us so far. So, no. And it's the kind of low-resolution thinking that just gets us absolutely nowhere. I like what Lomborg did way better. I think it's way more intelligent. So, maybe if you increase child nutrition enough and you produce another, 10 million geniuses as a consequence of that, and maybe one of them will figure out what to do about global warming. Well, I'm serious about that, It's not a bad thing to increase the total sum of human brain power, And so we treat these things so lightly. Well, let's fix the planet. Well, we're going to concentrate on global warming. Well, why global warming? Well, because everyone thinks that's the biggest catastrophe. Well, maybe it is, but if you don't have a solution, well, and then what about all those other problems? What are you going to do about them? Well, we'll ignore them because we can feel good about, being concerned about global warming. It's like, one of the reasons there's more trees in the northern hemisphere than there were 100 years ago. No one knows that, but it's true, and by a substantial margin. You know why, in part? Because people burned coal instead of wood. It's like everyone says, well, we shouldn't burn coal. It's like, okay, fair enough. What do you want to do? Burn trees instead? Because that's what poor people would have done. It's like coal isn't good. Well, it's better than burning wood. So these things are complicated. So they're unbelievably complicated. And so, no, it's not going to unite us.
All right, so Peterson gets a little bit, like he often does. I'm not trying to put the guy down, but he often gets a little bit, sometimes in some issues he'll become a little bit uninspiring, where it's almost like, it's just, you can tell he's almost frustrated with, probably some of the rhetoric that he's heard or the false information that he's heard over all the, hundreds of talks that he's given around, North America and the world and so forth, where, he's always faced with issues that people just don't quite understand the facts of what they're talking about. Part of the reason why Peterson has gained so much popularity over the years, from my perspective, is he serves a very interesting role within collective consciousness right now. There are a lot of issues coming forth right now. There's a lot of darker aspects of society. There's the shadows that we face within ourselves and so forth. And a lot of these truths are coming up into the forefront right now for us to address. The challenge is people are sort of looking at these things and emotions are flaring up when that kind of stuff happens. Instead of us processing these emotions, individually and collectively, we're getting caught up in the emotions because we don't yet have all the tools to move through that. And so what happens is we allow the emotions to cloud our vision, to cloud our understanding of what's actually taking place in our world. And thus we take individual stories or anecdotal stories and we pretend that applies to every single person in a particular subgroup on the planet. It's why, various racial divides are happening right now, because people are trying to pretend that one particular group or race or even gender is hurting the world more than anyone else, because they want to take the single cases that they hear, all over the place and say, well, in our modern world, I'm not talking about our past, but in our modern world, that still applies to everybody, and every single person that belongs to that little group is bad, right? And that's not a very intelligent nor accurate way of looking at what's happening in our world. So Peterson acts as this guy that says, hold on a second, everything that we're enraged about right now, what is actually true and what can we actually understand about it? And that's part of the role that he's playing. Now, he doesn't always come from the heart when he's doing that, which is okay. He's still coming from a space of the mind that's allowing people to, work a lot of these things out in a very logical way, which is still important and plays a role. Now, when it comes to what he's talking about within the climate here, and when he's talking about uniting people, or how the global warming won't unite people, nor are the solutions that we've tried to put in place in the past, like wind and solar, for example, nor are they any real solutions at the end of the day. And this leads to what we've been talking about again for a very long time, is this idea that humanity is on an evolving path. We're evolving, and not only are we evolving within our consciousness, but the physical world out there has to reflect that evolution. The challenge is people are holding so tightly on ideas from our past. Moving back to wind and solar is nothing more than moving back to the past. It is not a revolutionary idea. It is not an innovative idea. It's moving back to the past. Humanity has long suppressed free energy technologies or energy technologies that are far beyond what we see today. In fact, most people don't even believe they exist because the suppression is so deep. I've seen them with my own eyes. I work with people who have invented these technologies, who have been bringing these technologies to the forefront, but there are issues holding back these technologies, and it's not just the systems and structures in place. It's the fact that people in our consciousness aren't ready to move into a state where we truly begin to come together. Because for the most part, we're stuck fighting what social engineering has trained us to fight, which is, I gotta fight the guy on the left or the guy on the right, or I gotta fight this person over here because they're a different gender than I am, or I gotta fight this, blah, blah, blah. And it's just fighting back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. The social engineering is creating a disconnected state of consciousness that doesn't allow for revolutionary technologies to come into play, because these technologies are meant for an evolved society. And so even as humanity is trying to solve its issues on the physical front, they don't work, because the solution that we require at this time is one from within. It's something where we must change the way our consciousness operates and sees the world, such that solutions will come from that new state of mind and being. When Peterson talks about this idea that, we need to find the money and we need to go within the economy and we need to figure out how we can increase the GDP such that we pull everybody out of poverty. These are all great things and great ideas, but they're all based on the current system that we have in place. And because they're based on the current system that we have in place, we're limiting our mind, our thinking, and our solutions. And he even says the complexity of, they're so goddamn complex. That's what he says, right? Why is he saying that? because the world was designed from a systematic perspective to be incredibly complex such that solutions cannot happen because the world is too rigid. You can't bring in a brand new solution into a world that is incredibly rigid because the brand new solution requires fluidity. It requires that things can evolve and change and shift easily. Our current consciousness matches that system. It's very rigid. It's very based on the material. It's very based on me and take care of me and not other people. Whereas when you shift your consciousness and you become more fluid as an individual, you don't get caught up in identities like what color my skin is, or what gender I am, or what political party I belong to, or what country I come from, and you start realizing I'm much greater than that. All of a sudden, the way you act, the way you be, the way you interact with people begins to change immensely. And then all of a sudden, these systems around us reflect that, just as the systems around us reflect our current state of consciousness today. So, when you try and solve the problems with new ideas, you're going to keep running into a brick wall, much like Peterson is talking about in this particular video. If we continually look at climate change as something that, it's this big scary thing that's happening that we're causing and it's a huge issue and we need to now implement a carbon tax, and that carbon tax is now going to cost people a ton of money so that we can create more rigid systems to pretend to solve the issues that we have today. That's all that's happening with this entire narrative. It's becoming political tools for people to play out their own individual agendas. That's what the CO2 narrative serves as, a political tool so people can play out their individual agendas. When you begin to understand that beyond CO2, we pollute the airways, we pollute the waterways. We're sending more animal agricultural poop, essentially, into all of our environment, that it's creating a lot of toxicity within our waterways. We dump a ton of toxic chemicals into our environment. We don't have to be doing any of these things. Instead of talking about the obvious, which is the ever-increasing toxicity of our environment, we're talking about CO2, which is not the problem, right? And that's the point of this narrative. So that instead of talking about pollution, and being able to look at it and say, hey, I've identified where some of this pollution comes from. I identified where this can, then what that allows you to do is say, well, hold on, if I eat less meat, if I stop buying these products, if I stop supporting these companies, if I stop doing these different things that are ultimately directly, I'm not talking about CO2, which you can't measure. I'm talking about directly. You know that when you buy a particular product that puts toxic waste into the environment, you are directly participating in that. When you don't focus on these things, you're not focusing on the direct cause. That is the illusion. That is the narrative that is being pushed with CO2 to cover up that reality. So, do we want to solve the issue that we have here with climate change? Absolutely we do. We want to ultimately solve the idea that it's about pollution, not so much climate change. The climate is going to change. If you do the research, as I have, and I'm not going to get into it on this particular episode, but when you do the research, you start to realize there are probably at least 3 extremely big factors that nobody talks about in the mainstream scientific realm that has to do with climate change. We're talking about getting into sun cycles and the solar cycles. There's loose conversations around this, but they're not the big portion of it. The majority of it just comes from CO2. They're not talking about cosmic rays. They're not talking about the various different off-planetary things that are happening that have nothing to do with us. That other planets are seeing warming that we're seeing as well. And it's like, well, hold on, where's the CO2 on that planet? What's going on there? What's happening? Where's all the over pollution there? What's the deal? Right? There are a number of other factors that have to be discussed, and you cannot look at this picture clearly without doing that. But when you begin to see all of these little narratives, and I think this is why Peterson is a little bit upset here. He spent 2 years looking at the truth of what's going on. And when you start to look at the truth of what's going on, you go, wow, this hysteria is a political ploy. It's not accurate to what's actually happening. But that political ploy serves to do a lot of things. So here we are. This is really about, at the end of the day, seeing the truth of what's going on, understanding it more deeply, and then taking actions that directly can shift the situation that we have when we're discussing pollution, while at the same time expanding and moving our consciousness away from this very rigid point of view to one that's a lot more flowing and a lot that allows for systems and structures out there to be created that are a lot more fluid. Now that's a much bigger task, a much bigger conversation than what I just said there. I understand that. But that ultimately is the journey that humanity's on right now when it comes to a lot of these subjects.